This is an explanation of how to duplicate a form using tape. The benefit of duplicating something is that you can take what is representational, something that's recognizable, an everyday object, and by using that repeated multiple times, you turn it into a component in a composition. It changes the way that you would look at and interact with that particular object. So the process of making a duplicate is relatively straightforward, but I want to show some examples of how I think this has been done well and point out some specific tips that might be of use to you. So here's where it starts out, where you pick an object. And I would recommend that you pick something that isn't too simple, nor is too complex. If you find something right about in between where you have enough maybe hard edges to it and some features that are recognizable, but not something overly intricate, because as soon as you try this process and you do something too difficult, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's just not even worth your time. So pick something right in that middle ground, relatively straightforward, and gather up some saran wrap, some plastic cling wrap, and some kind of a clear package sealing tape. Do not get anything too cheap when it comes to that package sealing tape, because if you get that really thin stuff like dollar store package sealing tape, it's extremely thin. It will tear on you in ways that you didn't want it to. And of course, it seems to have a mind of its own where you'll cut off a piece and it will immediately fly back on itself, taping itself together, rendering it useless. So get a couple rolls of decent duct tape brand package sealing tape, or one of those higher end ones. It's thicker, it's going to be easier to work with, and the less headaches you have with this, the more enjoyable it's going to be. So as you see laid out here, what you want to do first is wrap your object in that cling wrap very tightly. And what I'm pointing out here in this middle section of images is, don't go and leave some section that's webbed over like a cobweb, because obviously that does not hug the form very well, and your tape duplicate's going to have that webbing included in it. So make sure that it's nice and tightly cropped to your object. Doesn't take much time to do that, just a little bit of attention to detail when you're applying that. Now, when you apply that package sealing tape, this is going to depend on how quality that tape is that you're using. If it's nicer stuff, you might even be able to get away with 2 coats of the tape, 2 or 3. If you get the really cheap stuff, you're going to be doing a lot more than that. So it's really not going to work out in the end to go the more economic road on that. Now, once you have wrapped your object in the cling wrap and then wrapped it in the tape, what you've done is you've created this stiff layer of the tape, but it is not stuck to your object because it's stuck to that cling wrap. Now it's just a matter of removing that cling wrap with the tape attached to it from your object. So in this case, I selected a hammer. Part of the reason why is that's pretty easy to go at with an X-Acto knife like you see pictured here, or a box cutter, and cut into that without damaging the object underneath. You wouldn't want to use, say, a teddy bear or something like that. You'll cut right into that object underneath. You want to have a little bit of ability to damage this or scar it up a little bit. If you're careful, you shouldn't ruin anything, but just in case. So what you do is you cut along one seam. You only want to make enough cuts that will allow you to remove your object. So this starts about right there and then moves all the way up to the head of the hammer and a little bit around the edge there. And that helped me free it up and slide it out through this opening here. So here you see the separated duplicate, that tape copy, and that hammer. And you see a little bit of pieces coming off here. That's the saran wrap from the inside coming out. It's like you've disemboweled that object. You might have to push some things back in there before you tape it back up. But that is indeed what you want to do in the end, is go over that seam and tape it up so that what you're left with is a copy that looks just like your original object, but is lighter, semi-transparent, and again, not the original. You can make many multiples of these objects. Now, just as a side note, you could do this with masking tape or, say, another form of tape like duct tape. Masking tape here, I did a little demonstration where I've taken this vase and you can see a little of that cling wrap still on the inside there. Wrapped the whole thing up and then did the same exact thing. Cut it off, put it back together after I had that husk removed. Now you'll notice that there's some rippling in here. Full disclosure, masking tape is pretty weak. It's pliable. It's not going to hold up like package sealing tape would. So be aware of that. The benefit, I think, of using masking tape for some project is that you can draw on that relatively easily. It accepts other medium well, especially like Sharpie, if you wanted to do some drawings on it. Whereas the package sealing tape, not going to work so well that way. So another option, duct tape, you could make something much more durable, but also still a little bit floppy, a little bit like soft sculpture. Now, the goal with this is using the multiple. So here's a concept sketch I did for working with things like a hammer, and then my secondary object would be a screwdriver. So by using just a limited number of objects, repeating them multiple times, what you can do is create rhythm. We created this almost skeletal structure here with a spine to it. There's directional lines being created with the pointing of the screwdriver in one direction or another. The way that there's a front to the hammerhead and the hook to the back of it. All of those things can be used as features sculpturally. So think about that when you're selecting your object, is if you had many of them, are there interesting ways of configuring those together? Sketching, of course, is an important place to begin in designing a piece like this. And so here's a couple of examples of students who have translated their initial design into a successful finished sculpture using just a limited number of objects. In this case, we have like a kitchen theme. There's some mugs and some spoons. Simple, straightforward. And you see what they're trying to do with the design in that there's tension, the tension of these towers of mugs falling into one another, barely being held up, and then this pendulum of spoons with this negative space underneath, this tension. It's almost touching the ground, but not. And so this is an effective way of taking something that is simple in its profile and can be modified in a number of ways to create an interesting form. In this example, the student took foam heads, like mannequin heads, wrapped those up, took them out, and then also did some scissors. It's a little bit mysterious, a little bit ominous even, but it's one way to go. You could take this in, I don't know, a figurative direction, something representational, like here we have the human body being used twice. We have these hands repeated with these books, throwing them into the air, and that is being held up at the top here by some fishing lines, so an invisible hanging mechanism making it look like it is floating. Then over here, this is installed on a pedestal, different configuration, repeated guns, which of course they had a toy gun. They didn't bring in a real gun to wrap up in tape, so don't even think about it. And then arms, human arms. Had somebody pose for them, they wrapped up that person's arm and they carefully cut it off of their body. And then just the suggestion of the top of the head as if this body is drowning in this blue cloth. So thinking about these objects just as parts, as forms to work with, bringing them together, creating new forms, you can see that the simplicity of it lends itself well to shadow play. Here's some more tools. That was size, the weapon in the background of the last one. In this one we have wrenches and we have paint rollers configured in a way that looks like a skeleton or some sort of a steel frame construction of an architectural project. But one really interesting opportunity that I would advise everyone to play around with at least a little bit is the idea that light can really permeate these surfaces, being transparent. Depending on how thick you bunch up your saran wrap inside, or how thick your tape is, it will catch light or let a little more light pass through. There's variations within this. But if you look at the original idea of this piece on the left-hand side, we have these three figurine um, type things going on here, and then some sort of a tube object which was made to create these Stonehenge type post and lintel forms. Okay, so that's great. But if we look over here, this is the real draw of the project. There's this bunched up rock-like form with lights inside of it, Christmas lights, the sort that you'd have a battery put into, battery powered, very discreet, put inside of this, orb, and this thing is glowing, and then it looks like these little individuals are worshiping at this fire or this rock. You can see how the light plays off of the forms, reflecting and sometimes just accepting and absorbing that light. Very pleasing to look at. So I think that that's something that elevates it to a different level beyond just those copies. So here, these are actually Rubik's Cubes. Very straightforward to create all those hard edges. You just have to be precise with the tape application. Some of them you'll see have been cut in half, so they have a bevel on them. The idea is that this is sort of like a bubble. And so what they did is they created down here a shoebox with an opening and then put lights down underneath. You see some there. And they were purples and blues and soft greens, and it has the look of a sud, of a bubble in a bubble bath where there's that slight iridescence to it. So all of that's hidden, and it just makes that form glow. Simple design. Here again, returning to the representational, we have the figure, all of these hands being repeated, and they're holding light bulbs. There's one hand here that's suspended from the ceiling, holding a light bulb above the others, and that's the detail view of it here and here. So you can see on the inside, this is actually one of those little battery-powered tea lights. Again, lighting these days is so discreet and throws off a lot of light for not very much space that it's occupying. It's getting easier and easier to incorporate these sorts of things into projects. This was another very successful piece, and here you see from the maquette here on the left how it looked without lights, and then how it looked with lights incorporated. The progress, that's clear to see. In this particular example, what we're seeing is some books opened in various states of opening, stacked on top of one another, and then these pencils or pens thrusting outward from that. As you can really see how the light plays up when you have it on some kind of a program that dances about and highlights that form. And here's another very strong example, one of the strongest I've seen, where you have a very clear design in mind. This maquette has these skulls and then three swords being repeated, two next to it and one sticking out the top. Now, this particular individual wanted to go a little bit above and beyond and create some other forms that were not just duplicates, they were specifically crafted on their own. And that is these flames here that were suggested with these pieces of paper. You see them poking out like tentacles on this side. So this is how it looks without any kind of special lighting. You see the skull, you can see what I've left of the sword cropped in this image, and then you have those flames there. An interesting sculpture for sure, but with the lights it really comes together. And here you see some stills of that, where that light illuminating from the inside looks like a fiery glow. When you stand back from it, you have the warmer, hot spots on the inside, and then as it moves out, it's catching the light in a different way, obviously reflecting light, casting it out onto the background in a darker tone. So it looks exactly like a flame is bursting forth from the inside, but this will probably show it much more justice than those stills will. All of the shadows then are created at the tips of these forms, giving it further definition, and that's really the power of having light involved in these sculptures. So it's not necessary. You could easily have something very interesting without it, but I think it's clear to see what the benefits are of using it. It adds an entirely new dimension and a new element of art, technically, to the mix, and just draws the viewer in probably a lot more effectively than without. So that's using tape to duplicate forms, putting those forms together, assembling them to create some new artwork, some new sculptural form.